these couple of chapters from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, and then 16 to 18. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Verse 16. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. This is the word of the Lord.
Good evening, everyone. Great to be with you this evening. Please keep your Bibles open at Matthew chapter 6 as we look at God's word together. Holly is a committed Christian. She spends a lot of her time when she's not at work serving at church. She's involved in all sorts. She's involved in the youth work. She sings in the music group. She helps out at the International Cafe, and she's going on camp as well. Recently, something has been bothering her. Something's been eating away inside her. And the thing that's been bothering her is that nobody in her church ever seems to notice how much she's doing. Nobody thanks her for all the time she gives up to do these things, and in fact, she's just received an email asking her if she can go on the tea and coffee rota on a Sunday evening. And Holly thinks to herself, how can anyone expect me to do more? If only the people at church knew how much I already do. So Holly comes up with a plan. She decides she's going to make people at church aware of how much she does, exactly how she serves, so that she can get some appreciation. And whenever anyone at church asks her how she's doing, she sighs and she tells them how busy she is and how tired she feels because of all the different aspects of ministry she does. Cups of tea after the service on Sunday and chats at home group become opportunities for her to spread her own publicity. And it works. It works. People around her become very impressed by Holly's service. They say they never realized how much she was doing, how much time she was giving to serve at church, and that makes Holly feel a lot happier. Jamie has recently started giving money to his local church. After hearing a sermon on generosity, he was convicted that he wasn't giving, so he set up a standing order, donating a significant portion of his income each month to the church. Now, he's not able to spend or save as much as he used to be able to, but he knows it's the right thing for him to do as a Christian. And over the last few months, Jamie's spent a lot of time thinking about how much he gives, and whenever he thinks about it, well, he feels very pleased with himself. He's sure that he's giving more than other people his age, and whenever he sees his bank statement and the money going out every month, he thinks to himself how fortunate his church is to have someone as generous as him going along. Just sometimes, when things don't go his way at church, or when he feels undervalued by the staff team at church, he's started to feel bitter, and he wonders what he's paying for. Jesus says Holly and Jamie are in serious danger. Our passage tonight is a warning from Jesus. In verse 1, we start off with the words, "Be careful." Be careful. It's a warning. What's this warning about? Jesus says, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them." Before we go any further, let's define this term, acts of righteousness. What are acts of righteousness? It's not something, a phrase that we use in everyday conversation, is it? Jesus makes it really obvious what acts of righteousness are because he gives 3 examples of acts of righteousness. He talks about giving to the needy, he talks about praying, and he talks about fasting. And for his original audience, first century Jews, these 3 acts were the main ways of showing devotion to God. They were the 3 main religious duties that Jews were expected to perform. We might call them today something like good works, but we're going to stick with acts of righteousness this evening. They were the good things to do as a response to God's goodness. Jesus says when it comes to acts of righteousness, we need to be careful about how we do them, and in particular, who we're doing them for. Now, this passage comes in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is teaching about God's kingdom. He's explaining what it means to follow God according to Jesus. And at this point, Jesus is particularly explaining to his followers how they are to differ from the Pharisees, the religious elite in first century Israel. So if you flick back a page and look at chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says this. He says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And then over the next few verses, until we get to our passage, Jesus is explaining what it looks like for righteousness to exceed that of the Pharisees. And Jesus is now explaining what that looks like when it comes to performing acts of righteousness. I think if we were asked what it would look like to exceed someone's righteousness when it came to something like giving money or praying or fasting, we might say the answer is in amount. It's about the amount you do. So if you want to be more righteous than a Pharisee, you give more money away than a Pharisee, or you pray more often than a Pharisee, or you fast for longer than a Pharisee. Jesus says something quite different. According to Jesus, the things that are much more important than amount are attitude and audience. Jesus says, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them." And there's the result of this warning. Why are we getting this warning? If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. This is an incredibly important warning. It's one worth listening to because what's at stake? Reward from our Father in heaven. If we don't heed Jesus' warning here, we'll miss out on reward from our Father in heaven. We'll fail to live in a way that pleases God. So there's the warning in verse 1. And in the following verses, Jesus gives 3 examples of how that works out in real life. We're only going to look at 2 of these tonight. We're going to be looking at giving to the poor and fasting, and we'll look at prayer next week. But Jesus is saying the same thing with 3 different examples here. Before we get started, just looking at those examples, just 1 minute on fasting. Now, giving to the poor and praying are ideas, acts that are very familiar to all of us. Fasting might be a little bit more unfamiliar. Fasting is when someone denies themselves something, usually food or drink, and it's done in order to focus on God. There are lots of examples of fasting in the Old Testament. Here's one from Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah's just received some terrible news about Jerusalem lying in ruins, and he writes this: "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." See, he's given up on food and he's focusing on God. Now, the letters in the New Testament don't mention fasting anywhere near as much as they talk about giving and about praying. But fasting is something that Christians can still do. In fact, Jesus includes it as an act of righteousness here. So we might say it's a good thing for Christians to do. Jesus says that his people will fast, but he doesn't specify exactly when or for how long. Well, let's look at these examples. Giving and fasting. And for each of these examples, Jesus says the same thing. He gives an example of how to do these things the wrong way and what the result is. And then he shows how these things should be done properly and what the result is. And he uses some of the same words to make his point. So first, let's look at righteousness gone wrong. I want you to imagine the scene. You're in 1st century Jerusalem and you've gone along to worship at your local synagogue. Suddenly, you hear a very loud noise that sounds a little bit like this. It's a trumpet. You turn around to see what on earth is going on, and in walks your local Pharisee. And it's not just him on his own. He's brought with him 10% of everything he owns. Wow, you've never seen so much wealth in one place. There's crops, there's cash, there's all sorts. And the Pharisee loudly informs everyone in the synagogue that he's giving all of this wealth to the poor. And more than that, he'll be back next year to do the same. I wonder if you can imagine the reaction. You're amazed, and so is everyone else in the synagogue. You all burst into a spontaneous round of applause, and you go home telling as many people as you can what you've just seen and how generous your local Pharisee is. Jesus says that's righteousness gone wrong. That is how not to be righteous according to Jesus. And what's gone wrong? Well, it isn't the amount that's gone wrong, but the attitude and the audience. Jesus points out that in doing this act of righteousness so publicly, the Pharisee has shown the motivation behind his giving, why he's doing it. It's not because he's focused on God, grateful for all he's received, and therefore overflowing with generosity. Jesus says at the end of verse 2, or in the middle of verse 2, that it's been done to be honoured by men. His motivation is that round of applause, that increase in reputation. Jesus uses the word hypocrite throughout this passage to describe people who act this way. And the word hypocrite comes from the Greek word for actor. And what it means is someone who wears a mask. Someone who tries to look one way to hide the reality underneath. And according to Jesus, when acts of righteousness are done like this, it shows that they're just an act. They're a public performance. And in verse 16, if you want to scan down to verse 16, Jesus says the same thing about fasting. The example is different, but the message is the same. He says, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting." Imagine you're in that synagogue again, and you notice that the person next to you looks absolutely miserable. They'd make a commuter on a Monday morning look cheerful. They look really run down. They look, pretty haggard. So you ask them if they're okay. And before you've even finished your question, they respond more loudly than is absolutely necessary with these words. "I'm on my second fast of the week, and it's very, very tough." And again, you can hear the gasps in the congregation. Everyone turns around to look. Who is this guy who's fasting in such a dedicated way towards God? They must be really righteous, really devoted. I can barely make it to 10 o'clock without having a coffee and a flapjack, and that's after having a bowl of porridge for breakfast. Jesus says that that is righteousness gone wrong. It's all just an act. As we said earlier, the purpose of fasting is to focus on God, but this hypocrite here has turned the spotlight on them. According to Jesus, turning our acts of righteousness into public performances is disastrous. It's a disaster. Why? Well, Jesus tells us really clearly that when we act this way, we will receive our reward in full. We've already received our reward in full. Can you notice those words at the end of verse 2? And then again at the end of verse 16. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. What does that mean? It means when we perform for the applause of others, that's all we'll get. We'll miss out on reward from God the Father. That's righteousness gone wrong, and it's an absolute disaster. So let's think for a couple of minutes about righteousness done right. According to Jesus, what is the right way to go about acts of righteousness? Jesus says the key is to do these things in secret, before the Father alone, so that only he knows. In verse 3, we read, "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret." I love the imagery there. Our giving should be so secretive that if our right hand writes a check, folds it up and puts it into the offering box, the left hand is none the wiser. It should be a secret almost from ourselves. The message is the same in verse 17. Look at verse 17 with me. "When you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to men that you are fasting." Instead of looking miserable and worn down, put your best face forward. Get the face wash out and put the Nivea visage on, so that no one will notice anything different about you. That's righteousness done right, according to Jesus. Done in secret. Done before God the Father alone, not for men's praise. Now, if you follow Jesus' teaching here, you will miss out. You'll miss out. You'll miss out on honour and praise and applause from other people. You won't be known in your community as a great philanthropist. Nobody in your church will stand in awe of your devotion to God because, well, they just won't know about it. You will miss out on man's praise, but Jesus says we will gain far more. Listen to the result of doing these things in secret. In verse 4, Jesus says, "Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." And he says that the same thing at the end of verse 18, at the bottom of the page on the church Bibles. Your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Nobody sees the secret giver's bank statement. Nobody knows the secret faster's hunger pangs. Nobody knows what is done in secret, except God the Father. And Jesus tells us he sees it all. Every check, every pang, he knows it, and what's more, he rewards. Isn't that good news? Isn't that great news? Missing out on the praise of other people and gaining reward from God is a bit like missing out on a long weekend in Reading and gaining a month-long cruise around the Caribbean. What you stand to gain makes what you stand to lose completely insignificant. When we realise that God's reward is at stake, we won't even want men's praise. It will mean nothing to us. Remembering that will be the fuel that we need to cease from turning every good deed into a personal PR campaign. Now, as we come to an end, we're going to think just about how areas in 21st century Christian life today are particularly dangerous for us in this regard, where we find it particularly easy to make our acts of righteousness public, and we're in particular danger of missing out on reward from God the Father. So now that we've seen and understood what Jesus is saying, the danger we're in, we need to think about specific areas where we need to be careful. The examples that we've looked at tonight that Jesus has taught us about, they were very relevant to his original audience, but they seem very distant to us. We're the same in some ways, but actually our culture is very different to the people Jesus was originally speaking to. So I've never seen anyone turn up to church accompanied by a marching band and trumpets with one of those big novelty checks so that everyone can see how much they've given, and stand at the front of church for a photo op. Just doesn't happen, does it? It would be really awkward, because in our culture, money is a bit of a taboo subject. Most of us find it awkward to talk about. If we're British, we find most things awkward to talk about. But money is a particularly awkward subject. We just don't really want to mention it. And when you turn to the person next to you at the start of the service to ask them how they were doing, I'd be very surprised if they looked very miserable and declared to you that they were in the middle of a particularly tough fast. Did that happen to anyone? No. But that doesn't mean we're okay. That doesn't mean we're not in danger. That doesn't mean we don't need to be careful. Because our culture may be different. We have the same problem with our hearts. We still have the same desire for the praise of those around us. We still hate feeling ignored or unappreciated. So where do we need to be particularly careful? Well, I think those Christians that we thought about at the start of tonight's sermon are examples of where we're in particular danger. But before we go back to Holly and Jamie, I just want to make one quick point and remind us that Jesus is aiming at the attitudes of our hearts here. And therefore what he's not saying is that if an act of righteousness comes out in public, it's immediately invalidated and it doesn't count. Because sometimes there are very good reasons for other people to know about our acts of righteousness. For example, giving to church. It's very helpful for certain people to know what we're giving and when we're going to give it. Church treasurers use that information to plan budgets and other things, and it also helps us to claim gift aid from the government, which is really, really good. So it's not bad if we inform certain people about our giving. And similarly, life can be really tough, and Christian service can be really tough. Doing acts of righteousness can be tough, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with sharing struggles with other believers for encouragement. But what we need to be careful of is why we're doing those things. We need to be careful, as Jesus says, that we're not using those opportunities to build ourselves up, to build our PR campaign. Let's think about Jamie for a second. He's giving, he feels very pleased with himself because of it. Why is he in danger? Although it's very good that Jamie is giving money for the sake of the gospel, it's clear to all of us, isn't it, that he's started to slip into self-congratulation. Jamie doesn't shout about how much he gives to others, that would be awkward, but it's almost like he doesn't really need to. Instead, his giving has actually turned into a form of pride. In Jamie's case, both his left hand and his right hand know exactly how much he's giving, and they're constantly giving him his own round of applause because of it. And rather than focusing on God's goodness, how much he's received, and how vital the work of the gospel is, his giving has turned into a performance for himself. What does Jamie need to realize in order to get away from the danger of missing out on the Father's reward? He needs to realize that the Father knows exactly how much he's giving, and that because the Father is generous, he rewards those who give to the work of the gospel when it's done for him and him alone. And if Jamie realizes that, if he realizes that he'll never be shortchanged by God. He won't be thinking about his giving in terms of how great he is at giving and how lucky church is. His thinking about giving will be transformed into thinking, how can I give more? How about Holly? She's busy. She wants other people to know it. She just wants a bit of a recognition from those around her. And so she's dropping the fact that she's so busy and tired into every conversation she can crowbar it into. When Holly is angry at her works of service going unnoticed, how is she thinking about God? I think she's bundling God in with the other people in her church. Just another person who doesn't notice, doesn't appreciate, but expects a lot. Jesus here says that God is not like that at all. Jesus says God notices every evening spent leading the youth club, every hour spent practicing songs Sunday by Sunday, every conversation had with an international student. He sees it, he knows it, and if done for him alone, he rewards it. That's what Holly needs to realize, and we need to realize that too. Jesus says that this is how his followers should go about their acts of righteousness, not looking for man's praise, but for God's. It's tough, because our hearts are constantly striving for praise, and we constantly fail to be careful. We're so ready to turn our acts of righteousness into public performances. It comes as naturally to us as breathing does. Perhaps you've heard about fasting for the first time tonight, or you've thought it through for the first time, and you think, actually, that sounds like quite a good thing to try. I'll give it a go. You mark a day aside this week, and you skip a couple of meals, and it really helps you to focus on God, and you pray more than you would on a normal day. It was tough, but it was worth it. What's the first thing you're going to want to share at home group that week? Our hearts are sinful, aren't they? We're so ready to build ourselves up. And that's why Jesus says we need to be careful. Now, I wonder if you're feeling at all guilty now. I wonder if you're thinking about the times you've used acts of righteousness to gain man's praise rather than doing them for God. I certainly am. If that's the way you feel, where can you find hope? If you know that you've done this the wrong way, what's the answer? Hope is found in the one who gave this warning. Hope is found in Jesus. If you look at the life of Jesus, you won't see any seeking after man's praise. He didn't receive rounds of applause for his righteousness. By the end of Matthew's gospel, crowds of people won't be applauding Jesus. They'll be crying out for him to be crucified. Jesus wasn't honored by men. He was killed as a criminal. For those of us who are aware of the sinfulness of our own hearts, we need to flee to Jesus for forgiveness. I'm going to finish there, but I want us to just take 30 seconds in quietness to think through what we've heard tonight, and how we, in particular, need to be careful not to make our acts of righteousness known for man's praise. And if you feel the guilt of knowing that you've done those things, use this opportunity to pray to God and seek forgiveness through Jesus Christ. 30 seconds, and then we'll hand over to Tom.